The courtroom was filled with an oppressive silence that made it difficult for people to breathe, weighing heavily on their chests. Every single seat in the courtroom was occupied, and all eyes were focused on the central figure, Sergeant Nathan Carter, who sat in his wheelchair, dressed in his military uniform, adorned with medals that caught the light from the fluorescent lights. The metal on his chest seemed to be gleaming, reflecting the intensity of the situation. By his side stood his German shepherd, Thor, who appeared calm but vigilant, and when viewed by others, seemed like a regular military working dog. However, Nathan perceived Thor as so much more: a family member, a source of comfort, and a true companion after risking their lives together for years. As the judge began to speak, Nathan's jaw clenched in determination, and he held onto the leash of Thor tightly, his hands trembling with emotion. His voice barely remained steady as he started to speak, his tone trembling with raw emotion. Sergeant Nathan Carter began by emphasizing that Thor was more than just a military asset. He was a hero who had saved his life in innumerable ways that others could hardly comprehend. In the battlefield, Thor had protected him from harm, shielding him from bullets, detecting hidden dangers, and even warning him of impending threats before he could perceive them. Even after Nathan returned home, struggling with the trauma of war, Thor had stood by his side, giving him a reason to keep going, to live with dignity. And now, the thought of losing Thor felt like a brutal betrayal. Nathan's words hung in the air like a challenge, as the courtroom remained frozen, filled with an unspoken sense of pity and outrage. Some people dabbed away tears, while others exchanged glances, their faces a mix of sympathy and anger. The judge's expression, however, remained neutral, unyielding to the waves of emotions that crashed against him. The judge's expression changed as he leaned forward to deliver his ruling, but before he could speak, Thor the dog suddenly stood up and pulled free from Nathan's hands, moving towards the judge with a sharp bark. The courtroom gasped in shock as the dog showed no signs of aggression, but was clearly trying to convey an urgent message. Nathan called out Thor's name in panic, breaking his voice, but he knew that Thor's behavior was not unusual, as the dog had previously alerted him to danger while on the battlefield. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as people wondered what was wrong with the dog, and Nathan's chest tightened as he wheeled himself forward, his voice trembling with urgency. He explained that Thor only barked like this when he sensed danger, and the judge's eyes locked onto Thor, his gavel forgotten in his hand. The room fell silent again, except for the sound of Thor's relentless barking, which echoed through the courtroom like a heartbeat. It became clear that Thor was not just barking at Nathan, but was aware of something that no one else was. Nathan felt a flicker of hope for the first time that day, as he realized that this was not just a goodbye, but that something bigger was about to unfold. Thor was determined to make them all see it, and his barks cut through the tension in the courtroom like a blade. Nathan sat in his wheelchair, his posture low and his body tense, as he watched the dog, Thor, react to something in the courtroom. His grip on the armrests tightened as he realized this was not just random barking, but rather Thor's body language indicated he had detected something. Nathan's heart began to pound, and a rush of adrenaline reminded him of the intense moments he experienced on the battlefield. But he was now in a courtroom, a place where order and calmness were expected. Despite his nervousness, Nathan called out to Thor in a firm but trembling voice, "Thor, heel." The dog briefly glanced back at his handler, his gaze sharp as if reassuring Nathan that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Thor refocused his attention and began pacing in short, deliberate steps in front of the judge's bench, his bark shifting to deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience began to murmur nervously, and their earlier sympathy for Nathan now morphed into palpable unease. Judge Carter spoke up, his tone laced with irritation. "Control your dog, or I will have to." Nathan interrupted him, his voice louder and steadier, but still filled with fear. "Your Honor, Thor isn't misbehaving." He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong. The room fell silent as Nathan's words settled in, shifting the atmosphere from skepticism to a creeping sense of dread. Before anyone could respond, Thor suddenly stopped barking, and the abrupt silence was jarring and almost deafening. Thor's body went completely rigid as his head snapped toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply, and a low, menacing growl rumbled. A sudden and intense threat has caught everyone off guard in the courtroom. Thor's instincts are on high alert, and his body language indicates a severe and imminent danger. The courtroom is filled with a collective sense of unease and panic, with everyone frozen in place, unsure of what is happening. Nathan is following Thor's line of sight, and his breathing is quickening as he prepares for potential danger. A low growl emanating from Thor is vibrating through the air, a clear warning that the danger is not just for Nathan, but for everyone in the room. The judge and the bailiff seem unnerved, exchanging uneasy glances as they try to make sense of the situation. The air in the courtroom feels electric, thick with an unexplained tension, as everyone holds their breath in anticipation of potential disaster. This situation is eerily similar to the many times on the battlefield, when Thor's instincts had been the difference between life and death. Thor's warning is clear. Danger is close, and everyone needs to be on high alert. The outcome of this situation is uncertain, and everyone is waiting with bated breath to see what will happen next. The heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room are the source of the attention, and everyone is wondering what could be on the other side. Nathan's hands are gripping the armrests of his wheelchair, preparing for a potential blast, and Thor's growl is still resonating through the courtroom like thunder. Nathan's voice was trembling as he tried to reassure everyone that Thor, his trained dog, was not reacting to the noise or crowd. However, his words fell flat, and the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. A man with a broad frame and a wary expression stepped forward, his hand resting on his weapon at his hip, trying to appear brave. He muttered that it was just a dog, but his voice betrayed his own unease. His cautious steps and deliberate movements suggested that he was not convinced that everything was all right. Nathan shook his head, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the murmurs of the crowd. He explained that Thor was trained to sense danger, and that his growling was a reason to be concerned. Nathan urged everyone to trust him and wait for the situation to unfold. For a moment, the courtroom was silent and no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs to investigate the door where Thor was growling. The bailiffs approached the door cautiously, their hands on their weapons. As the handle began to turn, Thor's growls turned into sharp barks, and his body remained rigid, his eyes fixed on something unseen in the dark hallway. The bailiff hesitantly stepped into the hallway, his face pale, and his voice broke the silence a second later. He seemed to be searching for something or someone, and his eyes were fixed on something in the darkness. As Nathan leaned forward in his chair, his chest tightened with dread. He had sensed that something was off from the start, and now his instincts were on high alert. The air in the courtroom seemed to grow heavier, as if the tension itself was suffocating the room. Thor, the trained officer, had his instincts on fire, and Nathan knew that he was never wrong. The dog's barking reverberated off the wooden walls, a sharp, urgent sound that commanded attention. His body remained locked in a tense stance, muscles taut and head low, with his gaze fixed on the dark hallway beyond the open door. The larger bailiff took another hesitant step forward, his boots clicking softly against the tile floor. His hand hovered near his weapon, and his body stiffened with caution. He seemed to be bracing himself for something to emerge from the shadows. The judge's voice cracked slightly as he demanded to know what was going on, his eyes darting nervously between the doorway and Thor. The dog's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that sent shivers down the spines of everyone present. The bailiff's face paled, and he looked back toward the room, his expression uncertain. He hesitated before speaking, his words measured, but something didn't feel right. His gaze shifted back to the hallway, his brow furrowed as if trying to shake off his doubts. The silence in the room was oppressive, like a heavy weight that was hard to bear. The judge's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried through the silent room like a gunshot. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisted with a growing sense of unease. The darkness in the hallway seemed to be palpable, a living, breathing thing that was spreading through the room. The tension was building, and Nathan could feel it coiling in his chest like a spring. He knew that something was about to happen, but he didn't know what. The room was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, and Nathan was right at the center of it all. Thor, being highly attuned to potential threats, reacted instinctively to the sound in the hallway. His growling and barking became increasingly intense as he strained against his leash. The sound they heard was likely a metal object falling to the floor, causing the smaller bailiff to flinch and step back. The bailiff's subsequent movement and Thor's reaction sparked panic among the spectators in the courtroom. The larger bailiff drew his weapon in response to the chaos, while Nathan struggled to regain control of Thor, his voice firm with a mix of fear and conviction. However, it's unclear what exactly Thor sensed that led to his reaction, but it was clear that he had picked up on something. The hallway, initially empty, had now been lit up by the smaller bailiff's flashlight, revealing no apparent danger. There was a sharp metallic clang that echoed down the hallway, making it seem like an object had fallen or was being dragged. This sounded unmistakable and was jarring in the silence of the courtroom. The metallic clang reverberated louder this time, as if whatever caused it was drawing closer. The air in the room felt heavy and electric, sending a sense of foreboding through the courtroom. Thor was no longer sensing it. He was now certain it was about to happen. The metallic clang echoed once more, a sharp alarm-like sound that resonated down the hallway, and the tension in the room snapped even tighter. People were trapped under the weight of uncertainty, feeling the pressure of the unknown as Thor barked with increasing ferocity. His body strained against the leash, as if he could push through the doorway and confront the unknown threat. Nathan gripped the leash tightly, his knuckles white, and his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it too. Something was wrong, and something was approaching. The larger BFF stepped fully into the hallway, his gun drawn and his eyes scanning the darkness. His partner followed cautiously, holding a flashlight that trembled in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway seemed empty, silent, and still. However, Thor's persistent barking and growls indicated that there was something amiss. Thor's growls deepened, and Nathan's instincts screamed at him to take action and call for an evacuation. Yet, he could see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. The judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward in his seat. The gavel trembled in his hand, and his usual authoritative air was replaced with unmistakable fear. The larger BFF glanced over his shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. He shook his head and said, "Nothing yet," his voice low but tight, as if he was struggling to keep his composure. The scene unfolds with a sense of foreboding. Those in the courtroom, including Nathan, are hesitant to speak too loudly, fearing that it might provoke whatever mysterious presence is lurking in the shadows. The atmosphere becomes increasingly tense as Nathan takes another step forward, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. Meanwhile, the spectators in the courtroom grow restless, clutching their belongings and inching towards the exits as the uneasy energy spreads like wildfire. Nathan attempts to reassure his companion Thor by speaking calmly, but the dog remains motionless, its eyes fixed intently on the open doorway. As the bailiff makes his way down the hallway, a shadowy figure becomes briefly visible, prompting the smaller bailiff to stumble backward in alarm. The larger bailiff freezes, his gun trained on the darkness, while Thor bursts into a frenzy of barking and lunging against his leash. Nathan tries to intervene, shouting for the bailiff to retreat from the situation, but his voice is drowned out by the growing chaos in the courtroom. The judge attempts to regain order, but it's too late. The panic has taken hold, and people are rising from their seats, shouting and murmuring in alarm. As the darkness in the hallway seems to grow more menacing, a deliberate, heavy footstep begins to echo down the corridor. The sound is calm and deliberate, but it's also getting closer, sending Thor into a snarl of fury as it pushes forward with unrelenting force. Nathan is faced with an uncertain and terrifying situation, unsure of what is lurking in the shadows, but determined to protect himself and those around him. Nathan felt a sense of dread wash over him as he realized whatever was in the hallway was not trying to hide, but was instead heading straight for them, making its presence known. The heavy footsteps echoing down the hallway were so loud that they could be heard above the chaos of the courtroom, cutting through the noise like a knife. Nathan was anchored securely in his wheelchair, struggling to keep his balance as Thor, now snarling wildly, pulled against his leash with incredible force. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the dark hallway, waiting to see what would emerge from the shadows. The judge tried to regain control of the situation, shouting for everyone to stay calm and slamming his gavel again, but his words fell on deaf ears. People were scrambling to their feet, clutching their belongings in a desperate bid to find something to cling to, as if it could shield them from the unknown threat that was about to emerge from the darkness. One of the larger BFS stood frozen in the hallway, his gun trained on the darkness, while his partner stayed behind him, shining a flashlight beam nervously across the walls, trying to pick out any signs of what was coming. But despite Nathan's urgent warning to get out of there, the larger BFF didn't budge, instead squinting intently into the dim corridor, his jaw set in a rigid line. The shadow in the hallway seemed to be moving again, this time slower and more deliberate, and the smaller BFF gasped audibly as he caught sight of it, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. For a fraction of a second, the light caught a glimpse of something, but it was too brief to make out what it was. The room was suddenly filled with a sense of fear as a tall, looming figure appeared, only to quickly disappear back into the darkness. This brief appearance, however, was enough to send a wave of fear through the room, making everyone feel uneasy. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low as he commanded the figure to show itself. There was a thick, oppressive silence that seemed to last an eternity, with the only response being the sound of the bailiff's voice and the growling of Thor. The tension in the room was palpable, and the bailiff's body was coiled like a spring, ready to lunge at any moment. Just as tensions were reaching a boiling point, the figure slowly stepped into the light, revealing a man with his face obscured by a hood and his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements were deliberate and calm, despite the chaos he had caused. As he stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilted slightly, as if amused by the scene in front of him. Thor's growling turned feral, and Nathan strained to hold him back, but he was unable to hide his sense of dread. Something about the man felt fundamentally wrong, not just threatening, but deeply unsettling. The man raised his hands slowly, which caused the bailiffs to tense and grip their weapons tighter. When he spoke, his voice was low, calm, and chillingly confident. Nathan sensed a feeling of unease as the stranger spoke. The words hung in the air, creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in the room, making it feel even more oppressive. The man was clearly lying, and this was evident to both Nathan and Thor. The tension was palpable as the room fell silent, with the stranger standing at the edge of the hallway, partially illuminated by the unsteady flashlight beam. The low, guttural growls from Thor vibrated through the courtroom as the bailiffs held their weapons at the ready, their hands shaking despite their years of training. Nathan's heart was racing as he stared at the stranger, his presence seeming to thrive on the unease he was creating. The stranger's calm and deliberate posture made him seem even more menacing. He took a step forward, his movements slow and calculated, as if savoring every second of the attention focused on him. Thor, sensing something was off, barked furiously and lunged forward, his claws scraping against the floor. Nathan struggled to hold back Thor, his palms slick with sweat as he tightened his grip. He muttered under his breath. Thor nuzzed Nathan, indicating that the dog could sense something was not right. The judge glanced at Nathan briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly as he addressed the stranger. He held a flashlight in one hand and his other hovered near his holster. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with everyone waiting for the stranger to make his next move. The man lifted his head, partially revealing his face beneath the shadow of his hood. His sharp, cold, and piercing eyes sent a chill down Nathan's spine, making him feel uneasy. The man reassured everyone that he wasn't there to cause harm, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of intensity. He reached into his pocket, and the courtroom gasped in anticipation, someone whispering that he had something in his hand. The tension was palpable, like a fragile thread about to snap at any moment. Nathan's instincts screamed for him to act, but he was frozen, his hand gripping Thor's leash tightly. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding a small metallic object. The bailiff shouted, ordering him to drop it, but the man remained still, his lips curling into a faint smirk. He told them to relax, holding the object up where it glinted in the dim light. It was just a simple key, but Nathan's unease only deepened, and there was no sense of relief in the air. Thor's barking didn't falter, his focus locked on the man as if nothing else mattered. Nathan whispered to himself, convinced that the man was hiding something. The man's smile widened, as if he could hear Nathan's thoughts, and the dread in the room became suffocating. The courtroom was on the verge of imploding, with all eyes fixed on the man holding the key. His smirk stood in stark contrast to the panic spreading through the room, and Thor's barking was relentless. Nathan's gruff voice was enough to sound an alarm, his intense growls a warning to those around him. His firm grip on the leash betrayed his inner turmoil as he struggled to keep his instincts in check. The chaotic scene around him seemed to pale in comparison to the unease emanating from the smaller bailiff, whose pale face and steady flashlight couldn't disguise the fear in his eyes. The larger bailiff, on the other hand, appeared indifferent to the situation, his gaze still trained on the man. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, exchanged a knowing glance with Thor. "He's special," he said, his voice low and conversational. "Always knows things before they happen." The weight of his words sent a shiver down Nathan's spine as he tried to process how the man knew about his abilities. Thor, sensing Nathan's distress, lunged forward against the leash, barking loudly in a clear attempt to protect him. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with a sinister intent. The air was electric with tension as he raised the key, his movements deliberate and taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with certainty as he turned the key in his hand. The sound was almost imperceptible, but its effect was immediate. Thor erupted into a frenzy of barks, his reaction a clear warning that something was very wrong. The courtroom erupted into chaos as sudden darkness enveloped the room, followed by the appearance of two menacing figures emerging from the hallway. These figures, clad in shadows, held sharp metallic objects that glinted with a menacing intent. As the lights flickered back to life, Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he gazed at Thor, who had transformed into a primal beast, growling ferociously. The spectators panicked, pushing towards the exits in a frenzy of fear, while the two figures behind the stranger moved deliberately into the room, sending a wave of dread through everyone present. The chaos escalated as the judge attempted to regain order, but his voice was drowned out by the rising panic. The larger bailiff stepped forward, holding his ground and shining his flashlight on the stranger, ordering them to stay in place. Nathan's grip on Thor's leash tightened, sensing that the stranger was not bluffing and that Thor was the central figure in this unfolding drama. The stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow step forward, his movements deliberate, his expression eerily calm. The tension in the air was palpable as the figures behind him mirrored his pace, contributing to the suffocating atmosphere. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice smooth and measured, cutting through the noise like a knife. "No one needs to get hurt," he said calmly, but there was an undertone of authority in his voice that sent chills down Nathan's spine. Thor, sensing the situation, growled low, his sharp gaze locked on the stranger, unrelenting in his stance. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he responded, his voice strong but edged with emotion. "You're not taking him," he said firmly, his hand tightening on the leash as he wheeled himself slightly closer to Thor. "He's not just a dog, he's my partner, my family," he emphasized, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the stranger's smirk faded, his eyes narrowing as he studied Nathan. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," he said coolly, his gaze shifting back to Thor, where a faint hint of frustration flashed across his face. The stranger's gaze locked back on Nathan, his eyes narrowed in contemplation. "He's special," he said, a hint of frustration still lingering in his voice. "But keeping him will only make things harder for you," he warned, his words like a knife to Nathan's heart. Nathan's jaw tightened, his grip on Thor's leash firm, unwavering. "Thor stays with me," he said firmly, his voice a testament to his resolve. The murmurs of the crowd swelled again, some voices calling for calm, others whispering in fear about what was going to happen next. The tension in the room felt unbearable, every moment stretching into an eternity as Thor barked sharply again, adding to the chaos. The atmosphere in the courtroom becomes increasingly tense as a standoff develops between Nathan, the dog owner, and a stranger. Nathan's focus is completely on the stranger, and he appears to be prepared to protect Thor, his loyal dog, at all costs. The stranger's intentions are unclear, but Nathan is resolute in his determination to keep Thor safe. The courtroom is filled with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the dog's low growls, which sound like distant thunder. Nathan's grip on the leash is firm, and his eyes are locked on the stranger, reflecting the unwavering loyalty he shares with Thor. The two figures behind the stranger remain still, but their presence is imposing. The tension comes to a head when the judge intervenes, ordering the BFS to escort the men out of the courtroom. The BFS regain their composure and step forward cautiously, causing Thor to let out another sharp bark and bare his teeth. The stranger's expression shifts from anger to resignation, and he utters a chilling warning that this is not over. The scene at the court was intense and complicated, involving Nathan, Thor the dog, and a stranger with an unknown intent. The stranger, who seemed to have a smug and calculating attitude, took a step back, not showing any signs of warmth or genuine emotions. However, he did express confidence. Nathan, who was firm in his resolve, took a stance, emphasizing that Thor belonged to him and that they would not be intimidated. His words were powerful and hit the stranger like a cold, hard steel. For the first time, the stranger seemed to falter and assessed Nathan carefully. After a moment, the stranger decided to leave with his companions, disappearing through the door. The courtroom was filled with an intense and deafening silence after their departure. As people returned to their seats, whispers began circulating through the crowd. The judge tried to bring the court to order, adjourning the session. Despite the commotion and the sudden departure of the stranger, Nathan remained still, his eyes fixed on the door. He praised Thor, acknowledging his bravery and the job he had done defending them. After the courtroom cleared, Ethan remained, his thoughts racing with the events of the previous moments. He had no idea who the stranger was or why he wanted Thor, but one thing was clear: this was not over. In this moment of quiet relief, They found solace in the fact that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. This unshakable bond between them was a source of strength, something that no external force could ever break. Their relationship was not one that could be easily dismantled, and with a bond like this, they knew they could overcome anything life threw their way. The thought of facing difficult times together gave them a sense of security and peace. As they stood together, they felt a deep connection that went beyond words, a connection that made them feel unbreakable. This was not just a feeling of friendship or love. It was a deep-seated understanding that their bond would stand the test of time.